Hello everybody, this week's revision is on the Kaiser's Germany and on Weimar Germany. Just a quick reminder of the timeline for everything. So obviously the first lesson of this week we did our Nazi assessment. The second lesson we've done content, and that's what this YouTube video is all about. It's about what happened in the Kaiser's and Weimar Germany. Then we're going to do an exam technique lesson, and there's a YouTube clip on that available for you, and that'll be followed by the assessment. Just like last time, we're only asking you to revise 3 small bits of knowledge. We're going to be looking at how the Kaiser caused World War I. We're going to be looking at right-wing political rebellions in the crisis years of Weimar between 1919 and 23. And we're going to have a look at recovery in the Golden Age or the Stresemann years. So our first little topic is on how the Kaiser caused World War I. And the first way he did that was through his policy of Weltpolitik. So Weltpolitik was his world policy. This was a name for his aggressive foreign policy, his aggressive relations with other countries. He believed it was time for Germany to have a place in the sun. In other words, what he wanted was to take over other countries in other parts of the world, just like Britain and France had done. He wanted areas abroad that would allow Germany to become stronger, would give them lots of prestige, and also they get resources and money from those places. In particular, at this point in time, he was going to get his place in the sun in Africa. This was right in the middle of the scramble for Africa, where countries were snatching land all over that continent. And he did gain colonies, such as Cameroon. He saw this as a means of gaining extra support with the German people. There were problems in Germany because they'd gone through rapid industrialisation. So what had been happening was they were building up factories, cities were growing really, really rapidly. And what that meant was that people were often living and working in terrible conditions. He thought if he gave the Germans a little bit of glory abroad, they'd be distracted from their problems at home, and they wouldn't turn to socialism quite so much. Socialism was a real problem for the Kaiser because that meant that people were wanting a change in government, one that was going to be fairer. His system of government was him and the other rich people at the top and everyone else not really having a say. He wanted to preserve that system. But through Weltpolitik, he might give the people glory and they wouldn't be so worried about those other things. To achieve Weltpolitik, he would need a large navy and army, because if he was going to go and take over countries abroad, he'd need to be able to capture those places through war. Now, this was a problem with expanding his navy and army because that would upset the balance of power. For many years, there hadn't been war in Europe, and the reason for that was because countries kind of had balanced out power with each other. You know, countries were threatened by other countries' armies, but what they did was they knew, well, their army's that size, their army's that size, we're not going to go to war with each other because it would be too deadly. What Germany were doing was kind of undermining that and kind of becoming this quite difficult country in the centre of Europe. It resulted in increased international tension, but it was popular with the German people. They were a little bit distracted, but it absolutely caused war because in particular it upset the British and the French. They felt threatened by this because of the larger navy and army, but they also felt threatened because they were the two countries who had traditionally had the largest empires, and they didn't really understand why Germany were now trying to catch them up. The second way that the Kaiser caused World War I was through his aggressive naval laws and the expansion of his armed forces. So Wilhelm thought that a large, powerful navy would help him to build up his empire and protect it. So it's linked to that last one of Weltpolitik. Between 1898 and 1912, 5 naval laws were passed. The first in 1898 increased Germany's fleet to include 19 battleships. The Reichstag didn't really want that, but they were convinced. This meant that huge amounts of money had to be spent and taxes were raised. This would cause a huge amount of debt for Germany. But the really important thing for our purposes and what we're going to be assessed on is the impact that it has on its relationship with others, because of course we're investigating how the Kaiser caused World War I. So what building up the navy did over time was it started a naval race with Britain. Britain believed that they were entitled to have double the navy of the country with the next biggest navy. That's their 2-power standard. And it was all about getting into a race now because Britain had to keep that distance. They had to keep ahead. The naval race really began in earnest in 1906 when Britain invented the dreadnought class of battleship. This was the most superior, sophisticated battleship up until this point. So at this point, the race really, really began. In the end, Britain won with 29 to Germany's 17. But actually, it doesn't really matter who won the race. It's about the fact that the tension was created between those two countries. Tension that was already there because Britain and Germany were now in competition over empire. They're now in competition over the navy as well. So this was one of the reasons why Britain declared war on Germany. Wilhelm's actions had increased tension and contributed to them forming an alliance with France. Britain and France probably wouldn't have had an alliance unless they'd felt this pressure from both Weltpolitik and the Kaiser building up his empire, and also the naval laws. And of course, the alliance with France also includes Russia by 1907, and we have the Triple Alliance. But on top of that, Germany was also expanding their army. They increased the size of the army to 2.2 million by 1914. They had 6 million in reserves, people who were ready to go. And this worried other nations, in particular France, the neighbours, who were really worried about Germany's intentions. And of course, that also caused World War I. So Weltpolitik, that encouraged World War I to happen. That caused the war because it forced Britain and France together. It made Britain and France in competition with Germany. It made the Kaiser seem aggressive and grasping, and that was added to through their expansion of both their navy and the army. Knowledge of that is going to be absolutely vital to do well in next week's assessment. So make sure you know, well, I understand what Weltpolitik was basically, and I know how it upset Britain and France and caused World War I. And I know how Germany expanded their navy and their army and how that upset Britain and also caused World War I. The next area of study for this week, and the next thing you're going to have to revise, is right-wing political rebellions from 1919 to 23. So remember, when we're talking about right-wing political rebellions, we're thinking about ones that may be linked to the army, a bit nationalistic, patriotic pride for the country. Often these right-wing rebellions were centred around wanting stronger government, often centred around one person or one small group, and maybe taking away a little bit of the power from the people. So these often are those kind of groups or people. So the first one that we need to understand is the Cat Putsch from March 1920. This is quite a simple rebellion to understand. Many Germans had held these right-wing beliefs. What they wanted following World War I was strong government. And they didn't like the idea of democracy. Lots of people in the judiciary, that's the court system, so the judges, and the army were right-wing, and they hadn't been replaced when the revolution occurred and the Kaiser was gone at the end of World War I. And this caused problems for the new government. So what you've got for the new government from the very, very beginning is you've got people who are hostile, who are against the government. They don't like the very idea of democracy. They'd like the Kaiser back, or someone very much like him, or the military to be in control. So the group we're going to focus on for our first uprising are the Freikorps. So the Freikorps were ex-soldiers. They were a right-wing group who hated democracy, so that fits in with the other right-wing groups that we're talking about, and wanted a strong Germany. They really firmly believed in the stab in the back myth. Remember that what the German people had been told by right-wing people straight after the First World War is that Germany could have won. And actually, the only reason that they surrendered was because the government stabbed the soldiers in the back. The soldiers had not been defeated. So they believed in that. They believed that they, the soldiers of Germany, had been betrayed by their government, not that they had been defeated on the battlefield. And it doesn't matter whether that's right or wrong. I mean, in reality, they were really being defeated and they just surrendered before they were defeated, finally. But that doesn't matter. It's how this group felt. And they felt really, really betrayed by the government. The government then betrayed them even further with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So under the Treaty of Versailles, there was only going to be 100,000 in the army. So 5,000 of these Freikorps started a rebellion in March 1920. They wanted an end to the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted to oust this government who had signed such a terrible, terrible treaty that really undermined the army and betrayed the army in their view. So in March 1920, Wolfgang Kapp and General Lutzwitz from the army, they led this group of Freikorps against the government. And the government were now in a really, really terrible position. And they're in a terrible position because normally they might set the army on a group who tries to take over the government. But these were the army, or had been part of the army. So the army refused to crush the rebellion. Troops don't fire on troops, of course. So the government had to flee to another city in Germany, being Dresden. The way that the uprising was defeated is Ebert, the president, got the trade unions to mount a general strike. The public didn't want the Freikorps in charge of them. They wanted to give democracy a bit of a chance. They certainly didn't want, to be ruled by the army. That's what had largely happened during World War I, and things hadn't gone well. The really important thing is that because the judges in the country were right-wing, they were incredibly sympathetic. Now, remember I said that 5,000 people took part in this rebellion. One person received a short prison sentence. One person received a short prison sentence. There were no other punishments. And this, of course, encouraged right-wing opposition. So, really importantly, in bold at the bottom, you're going to have to know what happened. But you're also going to have to know, well, what was the impact? How did it affect the Weimar government? Well, great, it was defeated. But it really did impact on the stability of the Weimar government, of this new democratic government. It demonstrated that right-wing opposition could rebel. This group of 5,000 people took to the streets, armed, rebels, trying to completely take over the government. Only the general strike stopped them because everything ground to a halt. There was no post, there was no telegraph, no anything that kind of could allow things to keep going. Yeah, it was defeated, but there wasn't any consequences really. So they actually got away with rebelling against the government. So for this one, try and understand, well, what happened? But what was the impact? And the impact really was that it encouraged other right-wing rebellions because there was so little punishment. Another form of rebellion at this time was political assassinations. During this time, 376 Weimar politicians were assassinated. Mostly, some of them by left-wing opposition, but mainly by the right wing. That's a huge amount. In your lifetimes, there has been one political assassination in this country, and that was the murder of Joe Cox. There haven't been other politicians murdered in your lifetime. Even in my lifetime, there has been very, very few. So this showed the real instability of this amount of politicians were being killed. A right-wing Freikorps group called the Organisation Consul, or the OC, they assassinated government ministers like Erzberger, who was associated with the armistice. He had signed the surrender from World War I, and Walter Rathenau, who was the foreign minister. So it wasn't just local government officials, it was also high-profile members of the government. This is the killer stat here. The assassins of politicians only got an average of 4 years in prison. They literally got away with murder. 4 years in prison for murder is very low anyway, isn't it? But some of them, of course, got less than that. Some of them got away with it entirely. So what impact did these assassinations have? Well, they demonstrated that right-wing opposition could constantly threaten the government with few consequences, just like we'd seen with the Cat Putsch. And finally, a rebellion that I hope you're pretty familiar with. So this is the Munich Putsch of November 1923. So Hitler and the Nazis had planned a rebellion in Bavaria in southern Germany. And he had the support at this point of other right-wing politicians from other political groups, including the governor of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr. Now, of course, that gave the Nazis a huge amount of credibility if they've actually got the governor, the boss of that area. So essentially what they were going to do was they were going to take over Munich, and they were going to march over into Berlin and take over the national government. They believed this was a really good time because hyperinflation had been going on. The government had been largely, shown to be incompetent. They were very unpopular. So despite the fact that, by this point, the new currency had been introduced and things were beginning to recover, people hadn't forgiven the government. People had, memories of what it was like just a few short months before. But also, any money that had been lost in hyperinflation stayed lost. People had really, really lost out. And so Hitler believed that the time was right to take over. However, despite the fact that von Kahr had agreed to help Hitler and help lead the rebellion, he hesitated. And Hitler and 600 stormtroopers burst into a meeting at a beer hall where Kahr was speaking and forced him to declare the rebellion. They said, You may not say that you are part of this anymore, but you are. You're going to be part of this. We are going to take over Munich in the morning, and then we're going to march on to Berlin. The very next day, so this is happening on the 8th and the 9th of November of 1923, the Nazis, with General Ludendorff, who was a massive war hero and again gave the movement credibility, they marched on Munich. Unknown to them, they'd been betrayed by von Kahr. Von Kahr, who still did not want to take part in the rebellion, he had phoned the armed police. And then the Nazis were defeated in a short battle. 16 Nazis were killed and Hitler was arrested. Now, it wasn't successful, of course, this Munich Putsch, this rebellion, this uprising, but it had really important consequences for the Nazi Party. People all around the country now knew who he was. He made the government look foolish during his trial, and he showed himself as a hero. But again, the really important thing for you here is this bottom bullet point. Despite the fact that the rebellion failed, stability was harmed. It made people question the Weimar government. The government appeared to have completely lost control because, again, you've got another armed uprising, another armed rebellion. So despite the fact that the government seems to have got a little bit of a hold on the economy and hyperinflation at this point, they haven't got a real handle on politics and everything feels very, very chaotic. The last area for revision this week is economic recovery in the Stresemann years. So let's remember what the problem was, and it links back to what we were just looking at, hyperinflation. The hyperinflation crisis caused by reparations and the invasion of the Ruhr. So remember in January of 1923, the Germans had failed to make their reparations payments, and the French decided they were going to collect by force by invading the Ruhr. The government ordered the workers to go on strike. Because they'd ordered them to go on strike, they had to keep paying them, but they didn't have the money, so they printed more paper money. That led to the collapse of the economy, essentially, and money became worthless. And at this point, Germany had been spending 40 times its income. The economic situation was unbelievably desperate. So what happened between 1924 and 1929 to make the recovery? We don't really need to know about what happened in those very early months when Stresemann was Chancellor, because the question you're going to be asked is about 1924 onwards. So the payment of reparations, which had caused the hyperinflation crisis in the first place, it had to resume. Because if it didn't, well, the reparations crisis would continue. So what Stresemann did later in 1923 was he demonstrated that he was willing to cooperate, that Germany now were willing to work with the Allies. And so what that led to was a renegotiation of payments, and it led to two really important plans that you need to know well. So let's start with the Dawes Plan from 1924. So the original total amount of reparations remained, but the annual bill was reduced for the next 5 years. So rather than making huge payments, they were going to make payments that felt much more reasonable to the Germans, that looked like they were something the Germans could actually meet. On top of having that reduction temporarily in terms of the amount that they were paying annually, Germany was also loaned 800 million marks from the USA. This is all about investing in Germany. This is all about making sure that industry got up and running again because it had been so badly damaged by the First World War. And then, of course, by the invasion of the Ruhr, for example. So this is about building new factories. This is about American money, American businesses, being there in Germany and kind of encouraging that. This was great in the short term. It produced jobs, but all of that security was based on loans. We'll talk about that more in a minute in terms of Germany dancing on a volcano. Added to the Dawes Plan, which of course was all about temporarily reducing the reparations bill until 1929 and those huge loans, the Young Plan actually properly reduced the reparations bill to 1.8 billion. But the annual reparations bill increased, and Germany would pay it off in 59 years, so they wouldn't have the debts for as long. American banks would continue to loan Germany the money, and this was coordinated by American banker JP Morgan. So these two plans gave Germany a chance to kind of get back onto the road of economic recovery. So what did this economic recovery look like? What were the good and bad points? And these examples are going to be really, really useful to you in the exam, because you're going to need to give examples of what was good about this economic recovery at this time, but what were the issues, what were the weaknesses? So first sign of recovery was industrial production levels at last overtook those from 1913, so before World War One. It took all of that time, it took 15 years to get German industrial production up to and then overtaking the level it had been at before World War One. That was the devastation that World War One had caused. So that's a great thing. Industry was now back on its feet. It was now back to where it needed to be. In contrast to that, though, agricultural production did not get to its pre-war levels. So farming wasn't quite the same. So in terms of food production, that wasn't where it needed to be, and it was quite a long way from where it needed to be. Again, in terms of recovery, well, IG Farben, German chemical manufacturing company, became the largest industrial company in Europe. And that had been on the basis of those American loans that had allowed that company to expand and to dominate the European chemical industry. And that was great because it brought in huge amounts of revenue. It created lots and lots of jobs. However, because it was based on loans, this wasn't sustainable. German industry became completely dependent on these loans. These factories were only able to expand and get bigger and better because of those loans. So when Stresemann had said that Germany was dancing on the edge of a volcano, this is exactly what he was talking about. Yeah, they were there and all at the moment looked good, but at any moment it could all collapse. So if you think about a volcano, it could be ready to explode at any point. And that's what Stresemann was worried about, that underneath it all, it wasn't on a stable foundation, because at any time America could want their money back. The reparations issue was stabilised. This is another good thing, and it improved international relations. Exports doubled because Germany was now having good relationships with its neighbours in Europe and further afield. More orders came in because the factories were expanding and getting a good reputation. More orders came in. The economy was growing at a really healthy 4% a year. So what that meant was that, yes, people had more faith in German companies, there was more employment, and because reparations were now kind of being sorted, everything seemed on the surface to be okay. But not only were they now dependent on on loans from America, they were also now completely reliant on international trade. So if anything happens to the world economy, well, they've got problems because they have so much debt, in particular to America, of course, and their economy is totally reliant on trading with those other countries. So when the Wall Street crash did happen in October 1929, 50,000 German businesses collapsed. 6 million Germans became unemployed. This shows that all of those supposed economic recoveries weren't really working. Finally then, in terms of economic recovery, so the government did try to improve the standard of living from 1924 to 1929. There were generous pensions for the elderly. Health and unemployment insurance schemes were set up in 1927. So all of this demonstrated the government felt confident, the government felt it had money because it could invest in its people, making sure that they were going to be good citizens and good workers and have good health. But maybe the government was spending too much money. They continued in the 1920s, into the later 1920s, from spending more than they had. The government received a lot of money in taxation, of course, but it spent more than the money it was getting back from taxation, and so they kept building up the debt. So remember, they already owe the Americans huge amounts of money. They're not actually getting any better in terms of debt. They're getting worse, and that is not a good thing. So the very final point. It was seen as a golden age of culture. Berlin was seen as the cultural capital of the world. There was an explosion of creativity in art, film, literature, architecture, the Bauhaus movement. There was more modern and liberal atmosphere. Berlin became, such an important city. Women at this point had new rights, new freedoms, and people were much more open about their sexuality. This was a time where being young was a wonderful thing in the German cities. However, a lot of Germans were horrified by these changes. Many right-wing organisations who believed in traditional values regarded this culture as immoral. It divided society further. So ensure this week that you make sure you know, how did the Kaiser cause World War I? Make sure you know what were these political, these right-wing rebellions that occurred in the early 1920s, and make sure you are really, really clear on some pros and cons of economic recovery in the Stresemann era.